Bruce, thank you for that warm introduction. You read it just about the way I wrote it. I'll try to keep my remarks brief today, especially for those of you who had a big breakfast. In fact, Ronald Reagan liked to tell a story about ancient Rome. It happens in the Colosseum. The gladiators are there, and a bunch of hungry lions are turned loose, and one of the gladiators goes over to the lions and whispers something, and suddenly all the lions lie down and go to sleep. Well, as you can imagine, the crowd in the Colosseum is absolutely furious. They're shaking their fists and howling with rage, and Caesar sends for the man to be brought to the imperial box, and when he gets there, Caesar asks the gladiator, "What did you say to those lions?" And the gladiator says, "I just told them that after they ate, there'd be speeches." I live in Washington, which is certainly a town with a tough sense of humor. They make jokes about everything there. The big story, of course, is still Donald Trump, the 45th president of the United States, I would argue the biggest political stunner in our history. When Trump moved into the White House on January 20th, he became the first president to move in and hang up his own portrait. He also changed his eating habits. President Trump swore off McDonald's and KFC, and he's trying to get Chipotle deported. One of his first meetings with a foreign leader was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. At their joint news conference, Bibi said, "There is no greater supporter of the Jewish state than Donald Trump." "Absolutely," Mr. Trump responded. "I love Florida, fantastic Jewish state." The president's big push now, as you know, is to simplify the tax system. The other day, he promised under his plan 95% of Americans will be able to file their tax returns on a single page. That's only one more page than Trump uses. And there's open fighting now, open fighting between the president and top members of his own party, like Tennessee Republican Senator Bob Corker. The other day, Trump tweeted about what he said was, or rather Corker tweeted about what he said was Trump's childish behavior, and he wrote, "Alert the daycare staff." The president was so mad he squeezed his juice box and it went all over his tie. Meanwhile, they're having security problems at the White House. A woman was arrested the other day for trying to scale the fence for a second time in a week. The Secret Service said, "We wish you were living here too, Mrs. Clinton, but you've got to stop doing this." Hillary has come out with a new book. I'm sure some of you know about the 2016 campaign. It's called What Happened? Out of habit, Bill Clinton immediately came out with his own book called Baby, I Can Explain. Clinton and the Democrats are still trying to figure out what went wrong last November. One of the big challenges was trying to decide how close to get to President Obama and to his legacy. But some issues, it turned out, didn't hurt the Democrats the way we thought they would, for instance, Obamacare. Remember when the GOP a few years back shut down the government to try to block health care reform? Republican Ted Cruz took to the Senate floor and vowed to speak until he was no longer able to stand. He ended up talking for 21 hours and 19 minutes nonstop. Nonstop, pretty impressive, but still short of the record that was set when someone asked Joe Biden, "What's new?" Now Clinton is reportedly considering a run for mayor of New York City. You may have heard this. Weirdly, this time she is campaigning in Michigan and Wisconsin. She's not going to make that same mistake again. George W. Bush, Bush 43, returned to the campaign trail during the primaries, trying to help out his brother Jeb. And even though he's been out of office for 8 years, Democrats still love to poke fun at him, especially his intellect. They still tell the story of Bush and Vice President Cheney going to lunch together, and Bush tells the waitress that he'd like a quickie. And she says to him, "Mr. President, I'm so disappointed. You were supposed to bring honor and integrity back to the White House." And Cheney, looking very exasperated, turns to Bush and says, "How many times do we have to go over this? It's pronounced quiche." I want to talk today about where we are now in this new world of Donald Trump's America. I'd also like to share some experiences I've had working in the nation's capital for more than 30 years. And I want to talk about the media, because we have become just as controversial as any politician, and I promise to be quick about it. As Henry VIII said to each of his wives, I won't be keeping you long. But let's start with Donald Trump's presidency, and I want to begin with a caveat. There was a noted screenwriter in Hollywood named William Goldman, and when someone once asked him to explain the secret of success in the movie business, he famously said, nobody knows anything. What he meant was that no matter how many hits you'd had, no matter how many Oscars you'd won, nobody knew whether the next big project would be a success or not. And that's true these days in Washington. No one knows what's acceptable for a president to say or do and what's over the line. No one knows what voters want and how long they'll keep wanting it. After decades in Washington, I'd become a little jaded. I had seen it all and knew how situations always played out. No more. Now I feel like a cub reporter covering a president for the first time. Just look at last week and the extraordinary feud between Mr. Trump and Republican leaders. We have never seen anything like this in my memory, this kind of open warfare between top officials and the sitting president of their own party, and not on matters of policy like Vietnam or Watergate so much as fitness for office and matters of basic behavior. I talked a moment ago about Senator Bob Corker, who says that President Trump is, quote, debasing the country. But that was mild compared to another Republican senator, Jeff Flake of Arizona, who took to the Senate floor for 17 minutes to call out President Trump. While never mentioning the president by name, he talked about, quote, reckless, outrageous, and undignified behavior. He said when this behavior comes from the top of our government, it is, quote, dangerous to a democracy. And Flake said, politics can make us silent when we should speak, and silence can equal complicity. And so, Mr. President, I will not be complicit or silent. Strong letter to follow. There are a couple of points to be made here. First, over the next year, from now till the 2018 midterm election, I believe that we are witnessing a battle for the soul of the Republican Party. The establishment, folks like Mitch McConnell and organizations like the Chamber of Commerce, will fight hard to maintain their control over the party. They think that their vision for the GOP, based on smaller government, free trade, legal immigration, and American leadership on the world stage, is the right path for the party and for the country. And they look back to the 2010 election when the Tea Party was rising and their candidates beat more mainstream Republicans in the primaries and then lost to Democrats in the general election. And they fear history may repeat itself and that Republicans will lose control of both the House and the Senate in November of 2018. And that's why a super PAC called the Senate Leadership Fund is preparing to spend millions to fight off primary challenges from more right-wing opponents and to personally attack Steve Bannon as a hardline populist with ties to white nationalism. I can assure you the Republican establishment is not going down without a fight. But there's another way to look at the last few weeks, and that is that the grand old party is turning into the party of Trump right before our eyes. True, both Corker and Flake went after the president, but only after bowing to political reality that they could not win re-election next year as anti-Trump Republicans, and so they both announced their retirement. And it's noteworthy, while there are lots of other Republicans in Congress who are just as dismayed in private about the president's behavior, they have been noticeably silent in public. The base of the Republican Party is solidly aligned behind Trump policies, if not always the president's antics, and trying to run while alienating that Trump base is a losing proposition. And so a number of top Republicans in both the House and Senate who can't live with Mr. Trump have announced they're retiring, while most others are simply keeping quiet. One of the big questions in Washington now is whether this divide inside the Republican Party is going to block the president's policy initiatives, and as you know, the biggest push right now is for tax reform. The House Ways and Means Committee promises to announce its plan for taxes this week. In fact, it was supposed to announce them today, but there is such division inside the Republican Party they've had to delay the rollout until tomorrow. Still, we know the broad outlines of what the Republican tax reform plan will be: a dramatic cut in the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20%, big cuts in individual taxes primarily aimed at the middle class, and at least on paper, a big increase in the nation's debt over the next decade of about $2 trillion. Now, there are a number of issues still to be sorted out. First of all, how to pay for at least some of what looks like $5 trillion in tax cuts. How do you offset that? There's talk about eliminating the federal deduction for state and local taxes, which could offset about $2 trillion in tax cuts. Residents of high tax states like New York and California, most of them blue states run by Democratic officials, benefit most from this deduction, and the argument is made, why should red states with lower taxes in effect subsidize deductions for high tax states? The problem is, even in those high tax blue states, there are some Republicans who get elected to Congress, and they are threatening to vote against tax reform unless some way is found to soften the blow for their constituents. Another hot button item, tax treatment for 401k plans. Right now, folks under 50 can save up to $18,000 a year tax-free before taxes, put it into their retirement plan, and then get taxed when they take the money out. As a budget gimmick, some Republican tax writers are saying, let's flip it. Let's say that you can only put $2,400 a year tax-free into a Roth account, but then you can withdraw any money after retirement without paying any taxes, tax-free. I call this a budget gimmick because what it means is the government will get more money now to help pay for these tax cuts, but less money down the line. One concern is whether the backbiting between the president and some members of Congress will derail tax reform. I doubt it. For instance, both Senators Flake and Corker, who, as I say, have been highly critical of the president, have already come out for big tax cuts, and I don't think they'll vote against the president's plan just because they don't like the president. Last Thursday, the president passed a budget resolution opening the way for a full debate on tax reform. The news, though, was how close the vote was, 216 to 212. 20 Republicans voted against the plan. If just 2 more had, both the budget and tax reform would now be dead. Most of the Republican no votes came from those high tax states where members of Congress don't want to see the deduction for state and local taxes killed. GOP leaders are promising to fix that and any other objections that their members have, knowing that they have almost no margin for error. But they're going to have to find some way to offset to pay for most of those big tax cuts, and any way they do it is going to be unpopular with some people. That may be the reason Republicans are now talking about putting tax reform on warp speed, trying to push it through both the House and the Senate, not by the end of the year as originally talked about, but possibly by Thanksgiving. The leaders figure every day that goes by, opposition will build to whatever is in the plan, from lobbyists, from special interests, and from just plain folks. So the idea is, go fast before that opposition can build up. Of course, White House officials talked about going fast and repealing Obamacare last spring, and we all saw how that turned out. My guess is that tax reform will take longer than anticipated. Legislation always does, and it will be declared dead and then alive a dozen times before we reach a conclusion. But beyond tax reform, I think there's a much bigger and more basic problem, and that is that there's a split, a big split on philosophy, on issues inside the Republican Party, and we saw that play out in the failure to pass Obamacare repeal and replace. Look, it was easy to oppose Obamacare when there was nothing you could do about it. And so Republicans, especially in the House, voted more than 50 times to repeal Obamacare because they knew anything they passed would be vetoed by President Obama. But with a Republican now in the Oval Office, things got a lot tougher. What do you really want to do about people with pre-existing conditions? How much do you really want to restrict the benefits and health care policies? And how dramatically are you willing to cut back on how many people have health care coverage? Those are no longer debating points. Those are serious questions with real world and therefore political consequences. And it turned out after 7 years of denouncing Obamacare, Republicans had no solid plan on how to repeal it and especially to replace it. There's a big split inside the GOP, and only now, when they're in charge of both parties, both houses of Congress and the White House, do Republicans need to confront that split and to work out a working government philosophy. It won't be easy and it won't be pretty. There's a wing of the party, and we saw it in the Bush 43 years, that wants, well, they don't admit it, wants what comes with big government. Case in point, the largest expansion of the welfare state since 1935 with the 2003 creation of the Medicare prescription drug entitlement. But if that divided the party between big and small government Republicans, now we have a whole new divide between traditional Republicans and Trump Republicans, and that could take years, tough years, to work out. With the Republicans in disarray, President Trump has toyed with the idea of trying to deal with the Democrats. He did it in September to avoid a government shutdown, and he opened the door to do it again, discussing DACA and a way to protect the so-called Dreamers over dinner a few weeks ago at the White House with his new friends, Chuck and Nancy, as he calls them. Incidentally, the menu for that dinner at the White House was Chinese food and chocolate cream pie, which strikes me as the most revolting combination I've ever heard of. Within days, that deal with Chuck and Nancy fell apart when the president said his price for extending DACA was to build a wall and impose tough new limits on legal immigration. Now, don't get me wrong. I can understand the president's interest in playing the Democratic card. Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell persuaded him to go for repeal of Obamacare at the start of his administration, and that turned out to be a disaster. First, hardline conservatives in the House, the so-called Freedom Caucus, held him up, constantly demanding more and more changes to repeal and replace. And then when the bill finally got to the Senate, the president was held hostage by about 6 Republican senators, some saying the bill went too far, others saying that it didn't go far enough. In the end, he ended up losing on health care reform by a single vote when Senator John McCain literally put his thumb down. So the president apparently decided to send a message to Republican leaders: I can do this without you. I can cut a deal with Chuck and Nancy and leave you on the sidelines, and you won't like it one bit. But here's where I think there's a flaw in his reasoning. What does Donald Trump really want? There have always been questions since the campaign whether he is a true conservative or whether he just adopted conservative policies to win the Republican nomination. Well, over the course of the next 6 months, a year, I think we're going to find out. There is a deal to be made on health care with Democrats, but it's to prop up Obamacare, not to repeal and replace it. There's a deal to be made with Democrats on immigration, but it won't include a border wall. There's a deal to be made on tax reform, and the president talks about trying to pick off a few Democratic votes in the Senate, but they are going to insist, the Democrats are, that tax cuts go just to the middle class and not also to top earners, and so far the Trump tax plan doesn't do that. The question is, does the president care more about victories, about signing something, or does he care more about sticking to what he said was his governing philosophy during the campaign? We may find out in the coming battle over tax reform and other legislative fights down the line, but to the degree Trump stays true to what we understand as Trumpism, I think it's going to be hard for him to find areas of compromise with the Democrats. There's one more factor in all this. GOP leaders in Congress are not just passive bystanders here. Paul Ryan in the House, Mitch McConnell in the Senate control what gets to the floor for a vote and when. They control how bills are written. I promise you, both of them were shaken by the president's flirtation with the left over recent weeks, and if they feel it jeopardizes their leadership positions or the likelihood that their members will win next November and hold on to control of the House and the Senate, you can be sure they will fire warning shots of their own towards the White House. In fact, some Republicans have already warned this president to leave writing the tax reform bill, quote, to the professionals. These have been the most interesting, most news-making 9 months of my career in Washington, but we may just be getting started. I got to play a special role in the last election as the moderator of the third and final presidential debate. The whole thing is run by something called the Commission on Presidential Debates, a blue ribbon bipartisan panel of former officials. And last September, I got a call from Janet Brown, who is the executive director of the debate commission. She formally invited me to moderate the final presidential debate. I was thrilled, but I took the responsibility very seriously. This is part of the process by which we choose our president over the next 4 years. It's a civics lesson that plays out in real time in our case and was watched by 80 million Americans. That's the third biggest audience in the history of presidential debates. But something interesting happened at the end of the conversation. Janet Brown said to me, "Thank you for accepting." My initial reaction was, "Thank me." I thought I had just won a golden ticket to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. But pretty quickly, I understood what she meant. The criticism that rained down on the moderators of the first 3 debates, 2 presidential, 1 vice presidential, was brutal. I think the race became so polarized, it spilled over into perceptions of how the media was covering it. And now I had signed up for the 3rd and final presidential debate, just as the focus on the race got white hot. No wonder Janet Brown said thank you. There were 6 weeks between the announcement and when I would be moderating the final debate on October 19th. I really couldn't start preparing because who knew how things were going to change during those 6 weeks, what issues were going to come up, what controversies would arise. Finally, after the 2nd presidential debate on October 9th, I could get to work, and this is where the good part of batting cleanup came in. Because after all the talk about Access Hollywood tapes and former overweight beauty queens, I figured voters were hungry for some real issues, and there still had been in 2 presidential debates, that's 3 hours, 180 minutes, there still had been no discussion of the Supreme Court and gun rights and abortion and immigration and debt and entitlement. So I decided I was going to spend the first 45 minutes talking about the real issues that affect our lives before I asked a single question about groping or pay-to-play or emails. Now, let me take you to the final 3 days before the debate in Las Vegas. One of our big concerns was how to make sure that no one from either campaign saw our questions. We were constantly revising what I was going to ask, so we ended up with lots of paper we didn't want anyone to see. I'm sure some of you were saying, well, yes, they've invented something, Chris, it's called a paper shredder. We didn't have the wit to think about that. So my team, including my wife, Lorraine, would rip up the old pages and stuff them into those plastic laundry bags you find in a hotel closet. But when the bags were full, they'd mix up some strips, take some from this, some from that, so that people couldn't put them back together. My wife would take her stash and dump it in the casino. My researcher would take hers and dump it near the swimming pool, and my executive producer would toss her stuff near the all-you-can-eat buffet. The day before the debate, they had me come over to the debate hall, to the arena, to do a run-through, a practice debate to get a feel for the room. I sat at my desk. They had 2 UNLV students playing the candidates, and we warmed up. As batting practice, I asked a question I wasn't going to use in the debate. I said, what is the best movie ever made? The fake Clinton was absolutely brilliant. She delivered the best 2 minutes you could imagine on the Shawshank Redemption, noting the cinematography, the message, even quoting lines from the movie, and she had no idea I was going to ask this question. The fake Trump was not so good. He said, Scout's honor, Django Unchained was the best movie ever made. And he seemed to have absolutely no reason why. But the really helpful thing was they had both been told to interrupt each other and to talk over me. And that's when I realized for the first time that for all of my carefully prepared, deeply researched questions, the biggest part of my job during the debate, the real debate, was going to be keeping order. I was going to have to make split-second decisions about when and who to interrupt and when to let the discussion run. And every time I did that, there was the opportunity for big-time second-guessing. Well, finally, we got to debate night. When I turned to the subject of the Clinton Foundation, I asked Secretary Clinton about allegations of pay-to-play, and she quickly shifted to talking about all the poor kids the foundation helps, which meant I had to interrupt her talking about their charitable efforts to ask again about the scandals. And then there was the moment 45 minutes in when I asked Trump about those allegations a number of women had made that he, over the years, had groped them. Because this was the start of a segment, and both candidates got 2 minutes to answer. I wanted to give Clinton something as well in the question, so I asked her about Trump's charge that what she and her husband had done to women over the years was even worse. This was the moment when I became keenly aware that Bill and Chelsea Clinton were sitting right over my left shoulder. As I kept talking, I thought this was a whole lot easier practicing in my hotel room than it was asking for real in the debate hall. When the debate was over, I went back to the holding area, which was a locker room in the basketball arena. I knew I hadn't messed up, but I wasn't sure how I had done. When my wife Lorraine came in, I said, "Was it okay?" And she threw her arms around my neck and said, "Honey, you were great." I felt like the winning quarterback being hugged by the head cheerleader, which is as close as I'll ever get to that experience. So much for the happy news for the nation's capital, because I know the real reason you invited me here today, and that's because you want to hear the true story of my battle with Michael Jordan. Go ahead, laugh. But back when Jordan played for the Chicago Bulls, I spent a couple of months on and off at home and on the road running with the Bulls. The highlight was that I got to shoot some hoops with MJ. I'm sorry, that would be Michael Jordan to all of you. Now, don't be fooled by my cat-like grace. I've interviewed presidents and kings, but I've never been so nervous as I was when I got to play some basketball with Michael Jordan. Of course, I worried about the important things. What would I wear? Did I still have a shot? Actually, saying still presumes I ever did have a shot. So I took my then 10-year-old son out to a playground and had him rebound for me for about 20 minutes. Well, finally, the big day came, and I ventured to the Bulls practice facility outside of Chicago. As you can tell, I had given this a great deal of thought, and I decided to challenge Jordan to a schoolyard game of horse. For those of you who don't know, it's a game kids play in the playground. You take a shot, the other person tries to match you. If you make it and they miss, then they get a letter, H-O-R-S-E, you win, they lose. But when I proposed this to Jordan, he said, no, let's play dog. What's dog, I asked. It's 2 letters shorter, he answered. And then he added, I thought a bit unnecessarily, I got a feeling you ain't gonna win. Well, I set some conditions. He shot from the 3-point line, I shot from a few feet closer in, and he started with D-O. He said that was fine with him. That's when I started getting the full Jordan treatment. I'd shoot, he'd start making noise, the ball would clank off the basket, and he'd laugh about how I wouldn't like playing in front of 23,000 people. Finally, I started hitting shots. He matched me. Then he hit when I missed. So now it was D-O to D, getting pretty exciting here. Jordan is so competitive, he actually started getting into this. At one point, the greatest athlete on the planet started saying about me, "Please don't let him win. Oh, please don't let him win." If you don't believe me, you can check the DVD, which is for sale outside afterwards for $9.95. It finally came down to one last shot. I made it, he missed. I couldn't resist a little trash talk, so I said, "Michael, that would be dog, wouldn't it?" Without missing a beat, he said, "Weren't we playing horse?" True story. I'd like to conclude by talking a bit more about the media, because I know that many of you have deep reservations about us. You think we're too liberal, or perhaps in the case of Fox News, we're too conservative. You think that we either get our facts wrong or we make them up. And you think that, especially in television, we distort the news by having to squeeze it into our time limitations. Well, I just want to assure you that we're aware of some of those problems too. In fact, I'd like to tell the story at ABC that if David Brinkley had been around during biblical times, he would have begun his newscast one night by saying, "Good evening. Moses came down from the mountain today with 10 commandments from the Lord God Almighty. Here now is a report on the 2 most important." Well, let's see if I can deal with some of the doubts that people have about us. When I considered moving over from ABC almost 14 years ago now, I did something that most critics of Fox News never did. I actually watched it. And what I found was that across the broadcast day, the vast majority of Fox News reporting is straight, even-handed, and very watchable. During the last presidential campaign on Fox, you heard every nasty thing the Democrats had to say about Donald Trump. Back in 2000, it was Fox that broke the story that George W. Bush had a DUI arrest years before, and they broke that on the final weekend of the campaign. More important is the job that we do every day telling the news in an aggressive, compelling way, whether it's politics or the war in Afghanistan, and we do it with a fraction of the resources of the big broadcast networks. Now, I'm sure some of you are saying, wait a minute. What about Sean Hannity? What about Tucker Carlson? No question about it. They're conservatives, and proudly so. But I would submit that those are opinion shows, and labeled as such. No one would suggest they're straight news reports, and while they are both very popular, they are not what the basic mission of Fox News is all about. I want to make one final point about fair and balanced, the Fox motto, and this was the real eye-opener to me. I thought, coming from a traditional broadcast network, ABC, that we were fair and balanced. But since moving to Fox, I've come to see things a little bit differently. I think there are some unexamined assumptions in the mainstream media, some ideas that are accepted as givens. There is a widely shared sense that liberal positions on such issues as gun control and the environment, same-sex marriage and abortion, that those liberal positions are the conventional wisdom. More conservative positions, opinions, are seen as just that, conservative opinions. There's a widespread belief in the media that government programs always solve problems, that taxes on corporations and the wealthy are good ways to cut deficits and don't put a drag on the economy. I'm not saying those ideas are right or wrong. I'm saying they are accepted by most of the mainstream media as the baseline, without examination. Well, at Fox News, we say everything gets examined, liberal ideas and conservative. No one gets a free pass. What could be healthier? But you know, tough as the criticism all of us in the media may get, I can't help but feel that in some ways these controversies are good for us. Over the years, the media has gotten a little too self-righteous. We're busy criticizing presidents and popes, but feel we're above criticism. We're immediately, always suspicious of every public official. Well, criticism can teach journalists some humility. That is never a very pleasant lesson, but it sure can be a good one. I feel proud and privileged to be a reporter. It's been a ticket for me to be an eyewitness to history, and it's an honor to bring the news to the American people. Someone is always going to be mad at us, and sometimes we will make mistakes, but the Founding Fathers knew what they were doing when they put freedom of the press in the Constitution. Our job is to live up to that responsibility. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace.
Because when I moved to Washington in the 70s and certainly in the 80s under Reagan, things got done. People worked across the aisle, and there was this sense that, I know it sounds crazy, among legislators, that you would actually legislate. And that is almost completely gone now. I think there are a variety of reasons. One of them is, I think, the media, which I think has clearly gotten more partisan, and I think that feeds into it. I think that single issue politics has become bigger. You have these special interest groups, whether it's environmentalists on the left, whether it's pro-life groups on the right, gun advocates, gun control advocates. So people often are getting elected in a much more, for much more specific reasons and are towing that line. There's also something, and this has become only worse, and this is true not in the Senate, but it is in the House, which is gerrymandering. And part of the problem is that districts, particularly in states that are not so reliably conservative, let's say, as California, or as reliably, as liberal as California, or reliably conservative as Oklahoma, in the states where there could be more of a mix, the metrics, the data, the information that is used is so sophisticated that it is possible for whoever controls the state legislature after the census every 10 years, to basically construct a state where every district is either reliably Republican or reliably Democratic. And you then get in the situation, I was talking about it in terms of the Republicans and Trump, but it's just as true of the Democrats and the Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren wing of the party, that your only fear, you don't have any fear of being opposed and beaten in the general election by somebody from the other party. Your only concern is that somebody even more to the extreme will oppose you in the primary, and the result of that is that there's no interest, there's no political play to be made in compromising. It's only to go further to the extreme to avoid a primary challenge. One of the interesting things they've done in California is that they now have open primaries so that you have to, in other words, it's not that you don't have a Republican primary and a Democratic primary, you have an open primary. Everybody who's a candidate for the seat goes in and tries to appeal to everybody. And sometimes you end up in particularly liberal areas, and particularly with the state, with two Democrats running in the election. But there is something of, there's more of an interest in, it would seem to me, or just as a practical matter of politics, in reaching out to both parties, or at least to the center in both parties. The other thing they've done is that they've established, not to leave it to the politicians in the legislature, but an independent commission to draw the boundaries and not to draw these gerrymandered districts which go in all kinds of crazy shapes to try to leave one party in and exclude another party. And I really believe gerrymandering is a huge problem, and we've got to find a way to stop it, because the questioner is exactly right. There is almost no legislating that gets done. And I mean, just take a look at Obamacare and just take a look at tax reform now. These could both pass. One did, one didn't, with no votes from the Democrats at all. It would simply be one party. That wasn't the way the system was set up, and I don't think it's the right way for things to work. It's one of the reasons that Obamacare, I think, has not solidified in the country, is because it was passed with just Democratic votes. And I don't think when you're talking about huge social changes, huge government programs, it can be done by just one party of either stripe.
If my memory serves right, there's a Supreme Court case now about gerrymandering. Do you have any sense how they'll rule on that?
Well, it's interesting. Yes, there is a case about gerrymandering, and what basically the plaintiffs are saying is that it is so extreme that it gets very technical, very mathematical. What they're basically saying, there's okay gerrymandering and there's gerrymandering over the line, where if you do it by some analysis, you can say this goes too far in terms of stacking the deck and is too far away from the kind of percentages of Republicans and Democrats in a district or in the state as a whole. There was a lot of agreement that gerrymandering is a problem, but the Chief Justice, John Roberts, was very concerned about it, because he said, you know, are we now going to have judges in every case saying, well, this is okay gerrymandering, but this is excessive gerrymandering, and having to do it by a mathematical analysis? And obviously that has tremendous political repercussions if, because people in that state are going to say, well, here's the court, here's 9 elected guys in robes, or, maybe in the case of a district court, 1 unelected guy in a robe, making decisions which will end up determining whether the Republican or Democrat wins that election.
Given the splits, obviously we see some dissension in the Republican, but also on the Democratic side, do you think that we'll see a 3rd or 4th party in future elections?
Well, we just haven't seen a very effective party. I mean, there were 2 other candidates. There was the Libertarian candidate and there was the Green Party candidate, and they didn't get anything. The way the system is set up, it just doesn't lend itself to that. I mean, every 4 years, I hear this talk. The only time it really was significant in my experience was Ross Perot, when he ran against Bill Clinton and Bush 41. He got 19% of the vote, which is a lot, but because of the fact that in almost every case, not quite, but in almost every state, the Electoral College is winner take all, 19% of the vote and millions of dollars he spent, he got 0 electoral votes. So I don't know. I think it would depend a lot who the Democrats were to nominate. If, obviously Trump is seen as being well to the right. If a Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren type candidate ended up being the Democratic nominee, you could see a push for somebody more in the center. But having said that, we hear this every 4 years and it never happens. And if it does happen, like in the case of Perot, it doesn't end up making much difference.
Several people have asked this question. President Trump apparently likes to tweet things.
Really?
That's what they said. So how has social media affected America's view of information, news, etc., that you've seen it in your career?
Oh, tremendously. You know, I was talking to a reporter for the Tulsa paper earlier, and we were talking about social media and the way the media has changed, and I said, you know, I feel like it's the 1400s, and you're saying that darn printing press that Gutenberg invented. I mean, it has just dramatically changed, but the point is that's the way of the world. There's technology. I'm sure the monks writing on the tablets with the chisels were really ticked off when that printing press came in. It has changed dramatically. It's an extraordinary tool for the president. I did a Power Player. If you ever watched my show, you know we do profiles of people who aren't in the front of the news. We did a guy named Dan Scavino, who's maybe the most famous or most important person you never heard of in Washington. He is the social media chief director for Trump. He now, through Facebook, Twitter, and both his personal accounts, also the POTUS accounts, his official White House accounts, he has access when he puts something out through social media, unfiltered, directly to them, to over 100 million Americans. That is a huge tool. Now, you can say, is it a tool for good? Is it a tool for bad? Is it an effective communications tool? Is it ineffective? And the answer to all those questions is yes. It is all of those things. As we've seen with this president, it can be a very powerful tool for getting his message out. It's also been a very powerful tool for him to step on his message and to distract from what a lot of people in the White House would like to see him talking about.
I think there was a Cato Institute poll that just came out this morning, I think, actually. It's looking at you mentioned a little bit, looking at the media. I think it was roughly like 11% of Democrats' view and 68% of the Republicans' view that journalists are harmful for America. How do you respond to that, and what can journalism do to maybe get back to where it was maybe 20 years ago?
Well, I'd say a few things. First of all, what a surprise for somebody who grew up in the media, whose father was an exemplar of reporting, that I really don't like the talk about fake news, and I really hated it when the president made his comment, his tweet in February about the CBS, ABC, NBC, the New York Times are the enemies of the state, of the American people, I think he put it. First of all, it's just not true. There's a reason that we're in the First Amendment, because the Founding Fathers believed that a free, vigorous, critical press has an essential role to play in a democracy. I completely agree with that, and all you have to do is go to other countries where the press is under control, and you won't want to live there. Having said that, I think that we have, with rights come responsibilities, and one of our responsibilities is to be accurate. I think one of the things, and while I guess I would put most of the onus on the president for talking about fake news and trying to get the media into the fight, I think some of my colleagues in the media have fallen for it. I think that we have given up our role, our rightful role as umpires, calling balls and strikes, and trying to do it in as dispassionate and objective a fashion as possible. And instead, we have gotten on the field and become combatants. I think that's a huge mistake. The talk of fake news, I think, is not right. Do I think that there is biased news coverage? Do I think that there is opinion where there shouldn't be? Yes, I do. And I think, I'm sure some people will say, well, look at Fox. But Fox really has kind of a firewall between news and opinion. I mean, there's no question. Shows like Fox and Friends, and as I mentioned, Hannity and Tucker, and now Laura Ingraham are opinion shows, and they're openly labeled as opinion shows. They're not newscasts, but the news side of Fox really does try to tell it straight. And more so, I might say, than some of the cable networks, one of the things that I've always noticed is that on election nights or debate nights or convention nights, that Fox has always had the newsmen, Brit Hume or Brett Baer or me, anchoring the coverage, where MSNBC, for instance, has Rachel Maddow and Chris Matthews. So I think they are much more blurry of the lines. But what I really, to get back to my main point, I think that it's really important that news be news and opinion be opinion, and to the degree that you're putting opinion on the front page of the New York Times where I see it, or in the lead to one of the evening newscasts on one of the networks, or some of the coverage out of the White House, I think it's a big mistake. And I think that it weakens our authority, weakens our role, and to some degree plays into the criticism that President Trump has made of us.
You alluded to a little bit, the last election. How did everybody get it so wrong in the prediction?
Thank you for that.
Except you, I think.
Well, actually, I'm going to defend myself in the course of this. So, we did get it wrong, and I include me in that. You know, the fact is that the polls kind of had it right. You're going to sit there and say, well, wait a minute, they had Hillary winning. Hillary did beat Trump by 3 million votes in the popular vote, so, which is about the percentage that the polls had it. They certainly had it wrong in individual states. They had it right nationwide, not so right. It was a complicated race. I interviewed Trump in October of 2015 and heard his talk about, you know, sort of the forgotten Americans and make America great again. I thought it was a powerful message, and I thought that that it could have real appeal. But you know, there were a dozen times between then and election night where I wrote him off, as a lot of people did. You know, when he got into fights with Gold Star mothers and fathers and other people, and said he didn't like John McCain because, you know, he liked people who weren't captured. It was a tough race, and you know, one of the things that I've learned, and we see this with the exit polls all the time, is you're only as good as your model. And by that I mean that before an election, people have to come, and these are people way above my pay grade, and more importantly, way above my knowledge of data and computer modeling. You have to base it on assumptions of who's going to turn out and who's going to vote. And if you're wrong about that, if you think, well, there's going to be, because of some of the things Trump has said and done, a bigger turnout of African Americans and Hispanics, and if you look at the vote in the past and say the white conservative or white blue-collar vote is going to be at this level, then when you look at the percentages of support amongst all those groups, because in all those polls you're weighting what you figure African Americans are going to be 10 or 12% of the electorate, so you give that so much weight, and you give, you know, whites a percentage of weight equal to what you think their percentage of the electorate is going to be. If your percentage is wrong, if your modeling is wrong, then you're going to come up with a wrong number. And you know, it'd be like making a cake and thinking, well, I should put, you know, 2 tablespoons of salt in, or I should put 2 teaspoons of salt in. One's going to taste delicious, and one is going to be inedible. And that is kind of where, well, I think all of the media went wrong. And that's very hard to predict. I mean, I remember, let me go back 4 years. I remember talking to people on election day in the Romney campaign, and they were absolutely convinced that Romney was going to win. Romney was convinced that he was going to win into 6, 7, 8 o'clock that night, because they had a model that showed what they thought the turnout of various groups and various economic groups, various social groups, various racial groups, and they vastly underestimated the turnout for minorities for Obama in the 2012 election. They thought they were going to win. They had the wrong model.
Several people asked about the Mueller investigation. What is your view on that? Where do you think it will go, and what has happened so far?
Well, It's an interesting question. Obviously, there were some developments. The first developments this week with the indictments of Paul Manafort, who was the campaign chairman for a while, one of his top deputies who actually stayed on in the campaign and even through the inauguration, Rick Gates. Those were kind of expected, not necessarily, not Gates so much, but Manafort. Everybody expected that. I don't know that they thought it was going to be the first one, but it was widely expected that he was going to get swept up into this. The surprise was this fellow George Papadopoulos, which was a name that really nobody knew, but it now turns out that he pled guilty and that he was arrested in July and apparently had been cooperating with the government ever since then, which I'm sure is going to raise a lot of questions in the minds of everybody in the White House. One, did I ever talk to George Papadopoulos between July when he was turned state's evidence and when the indictment was announced on Monday, because he could conceivably have been wearing a wire, literally, or at the very least could have been reporting, or may have tweets or emails from me. And then the other question, and this is why it was such an effective tool by Mueller, well, if Papadopoulos turned state's evidence, who else has? You don't think people in the White House are kind of wondering, do I trust Chris? Because maybe Chris, has already pled guilty and he's cooperating, and can I do business with him? Saying how, one of the things that I find laughable, it's an interesting thing in the news business, because something like that comes out, you got to talk about it, right? But the fact is, you can't really say anything sensible about it. It would be like saying after the first inning of tonight's Game 7 of the World Series, well, who won? Well, we know the score at the end of the first inning. Maybe the Dodgers are ahead by a run, maybe the Astros are, but there are 8 more innings to play, and we have no idea what's going to happen in those 8 innings. I will say this, that the general feeling in Washington is that this is, first of all, that Mueller is a tough, sharp investigator, prosecutor, incorruptible, going to take it wherever it leads. He's assembled a very tough team. If there's, I have a theory about these things. It's what I call the baked in the cake theory. And what it basically is it doesn't matter what you think now. It doesn't matter what people say now. It doesn't matter if the president says it's all fake news. Something either happened or didn't happen. If it did happen, my guess is it'll come out. If it didn't happen, he's off the hook. So, the real story of where this investigation is headed is depending on what people did in 2016 and whether or not they lied, because the cover-up is often worse than the crime in 2017. If there's evidence there, they'll find it. If there's no evidence, he'll be scot-free. But this is a long way from over, and I think that there's going to be a real effort to squeeze people who are in the news now, or maybe, first of all, this is going to scare the heck out of people. Just take an example. Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort has been charged with, I think, 12 counts of actions against the United States. Even if he's innocent, this will bankrupt him. It's going to cost him millions of dollars in legal fees. It'll take years. If the pressure on him to flip, whether he has something or not, is going to be enormous, this is just going to keep everything in a state. I'm not saying that the administration can't get things done, but this will be an enormously unsettling factor for this administration for at least the next year or so. And this is going to take a while. This has just begun.
Do you think Trump will replace Mueller?
I think if he were to do that, it would be an absolute political firestorm. Lindsey Graham, who, interestingly enough, after being a real foe of an opponent of Trump during the primaries, has actually become a pretty good friend, said the other day that if he were tried to fire Mueller or defund him or get rid of him, there would be holy hell to pay. I think that in the aftermath of the firing of James Comey, if he were to fire Mueller, or the other thing that's talked about, if he were to pardon somebody like Manafort, we'd be right on the edge of impeachment. Whether it would happen or not, I don't know. I should point out that Trump President Trump, all of the Trump people, all of his lawyers say there's no contemplation of any of that, so this is a purely hypothetical question. But that would be hugely damaging and disruptive to the country.
Some Republicans recently have kind of floated the idea that President Trump won't run for re-election. Do you think that's a possibility?
Sure. I mean, you can write a scenario. Who knows where the country is in 3 years? Who knows where his health is? Would he relish the prospect of running and losing? I don't think so. Having said that, this is an enormously tough, competitive man. I did an interview with him right after he'd won in December, and we ended up flying together on Trump Force One, which was a really cool experience, to the Army-Navy game, and I was talking to him in the stands off camera, and I asked him for a reason, because he's the oldest first-term president we've ever had. He was inaugurated when he was 70. Even Reagan was only 69 when he was inaugurated. So if he ran, he'd be the oldest president running for re-election. I said, so how long did your parents live? And his father lived into his 90s, and his mom, I think, lived into her 90s. She was mugged on the street in Queens when she was late in her 80s. And he understood why I was asking, and basically he was saying, I got really good genes. So I would say, I mean, if I were going to go to Vegas and put money on it, first I'd put money on OSU to beat Oklahoma this weekend. That was a cheap play for applause, and you fell for it.
It worked well.
But I would bet that he's going to run for re-election.
Several people have asked about North Korea. What is your view on that situation and where it will lead?
Well, it's scary. My own feeling, and Trump leaves for Japan, I believe, on Friday, and next week will be in South Korea, and having been in Seoul, it's only 30 miles from the border, from the DMZ, and well within the range of thousands of North Korean artillery shells and rockets. It's interesting. My own feeling is that Kim Jong-un has made a strategic decision that his best guarantee of survival is to have a nuclear weapon. That I think he looks around the world to dictators who didn't, like Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi, who had a nuclear program and then turned it over to us as part of a deal, and they end up dead. So I think Kim, I know it's enormously inflammatory and upsetting to the allies and to the U.S. and to his neighbors in the region, but I think he feels being nuclear is safer than not being nuclear. Now, whether he takes that last step, I could see him sort of like the Iranians were before the Iranian nuke deal, just short of breakout, which is, well, he's already got a nuclear weapon, he already has an ICBM, I could see him testing them separately. Do I see him putting a nuclear weapon on an ICBM and testing that and showing that he has the potential to hit the U.S. mainland? I think that might be a bridge too far and might be, that point at which having this capability isn't a guarantee of survival, it's a guarantee of extermination. So I don't think he's crazy. I think he's probably savage, uncivilized, but understands the difference between survival and death. I think that's a lesson a lot of people learn in North Korea. So my guess is that he'll stop just short. But I don't see him voluntarily giving up a nuclear program. I think he would see that as, just laying the way for him to meet Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi in the afterlife, wherever up or down that would be.
That's right. We saw another terrorist attack in New York. So is there anything is this the new normal that we must be accustomed to, or are there things we can do to stop kind of homegrown terrorists from being radicalized?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm sad to say it. I'd love to say it. What's amazing to me is how seldom it happens and how good our intelligences, our Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, first responders in every city and state around the country, because it's so easy to do. I mean, it's so easy to, now, I mean, it used to be you had to have a homemade explosive, which got a little complicated and involved a little money, and although again, that's all too easy on the internet to learn how to do that. But now you just get in a car and drive down a street, and you can, here's a guy drives down a pedestrian area, tragically kills 8 people, and it captures the country. That's the lead on all the newscasts last night and this morning. There's no, I don't know, because I've been here for the last couple of hours, if there's any indication this guy had any real contact with ISIS, but, it's easy enough just to get radicalized over the internet, talking to other people homegrown. So, and I know, talking to law enforcement people and Homeland Security people, this is what they fear the most, because it's the thing they have the least control over, which is these lone wolf, self-radicalized people. You can be sitting in your apartment reading material over the internet and form a grievance, and nobody knows what's in your heart or mind or soul. So, as I say, I'm surprised and gratified it happens as seldom as it does, but I've never talked to anybody who thought this is something we could stop.
Shift gears a little bit. Who are the members of Congress you most enjoy or find most interesting to speak with?
Well, that would be hard. As Dwight Eisenhower said about Richard Nixon, give me a week and I'll come up with something. No, that's not true. The answer is, and people often ask me it in a slightly different way, which is, who are the guests on your show that you like having, and who are the people that you don't like having? And the answer, I'll be generic first and then I'll name some names, is that you like people who answer questions, and you don't like people who stick to scripts and talking points and long answers and, don't react in real time. So, who do I like? John McCain is a straight talker, and you ask him a question, even a politically provocative question, he'll usually give you a pretty good answer. Lindsey Graham is somebody in that respect. Among Democrats, Dick Durbin, the number 2 Democrat in the Senate from Illinois, is a good talker. It's basically, and I can name other people, Claire McCaskill, I like. Now you're going to be some names of people I don't really like, because they tend to give speeches, or they tend, you ask them a question, they just don't respond. Trey Gowdy, I just had on the show on Sunday, and I think he was great. You ask him a question and he gives you an answer. That's all you can ask for, but you don't always get that. I will tell you that I give a pep talk to everybody that I have on the show, even to presidents. And it's just sort of a gentle thing, and you'll sit there, he says this to the president. But I did it to Obama and Clinton, as well as to Bush and Trump. I always say, just before the interview, I said, listen, if you can try to keep your answers relatively brief, then we can cover more territory. Because the worst thing you can do, I mean, even in an hour show like Fox News Sunday, unless it's the president, it's usually a 10 or 12-minute interview, which is an eternity by TV standards. It's literally twice as long as they get on the Today Show, but it still flies by. And, there's nothing worse than asking a guy a question and he gives a speech for 2 minutes, and now if you're going to ask a follow-up, well, I've only got 8 minutes left, is it worth asking another follow-up and maybe wasting another 2 minutes, or do I move on to something else? So I always say this to people. I say, if you would just keep your answers short, we can cover more territory. David Axelrod, who was a top advisor to Obama, and frankly, one of the few people in the Obama White House who treated me fairly and well and came on the show. I was just to that point one time. He'd been on a number of times, and I'm about to say it to him, and he goes, Chris, if you can keep your question short, we can cover more territory. Which we both got a good laugh of.
There are so many sources. I mean, I read an article that we can tailor the information we get now with the internet and things like that. So one of the problems that we're so polarized is that we only read one side or the other. What can we as citizens do to be more balanced in what we see and what we hear, so it doesn't just feed into our own bias?
Well, it's a very good question. It's something that concerns me greatly. And the answer, I think, and I don't know that people are going to do it because, you know, for me, hearing all sides is what I do for a living. Most people don't have that much time. But I think it's really important to read or watch something that you know doesn't feed your preconceptions. Every night, I make a point of watching not only at 6 o'clock Fox News special report with Bret Baier, but also one of the 3 mainstream newscasts, because I want to see what's being reported. And to be honest, sometimes there'll be a sizable difference either in what they're reporting or how they're reporting it between what I see on Fox and what I see on CBS. And it's not necessarily to say one's right and the other's wrong. It's they're different. And, you know, there's a famous journalism story that, you know, there's a class like this and there are hundreds of people in it, and suddenly, as an exercise, somebody runs in and robs, it's an exercise, not real, and robs somebody in the class and runs out, and then the professor says, all right, each of you take 20 minutes and write exactly what you saw, and if there are 100 people in the class, you're going to get 100 different versions. Objectivity is impossible. Everybody comes at it, you know, a different way. They see different things. Memory and focus and it is different. So, you know, while both shows are trying to be objective, they're just going to see things differently. I think it's really important to do that, to read something that disagrees. I will also say this, that particularly with the internet, I think it puts a demand on the news consumer, which is all of you, to be a more discerning reader, watcher. You know, there's so much stuff on the internet that's fascinating and interesting and well-reasoned, and there's so much stuff on the internet that is just junk. And you know, how do you discern whether it's a serious website with an editorial process that is, you know, is really strong, and how much of it is just, as Donald Trump likes to say, a 400-pound guy in his pajamas in his mother's basement who's just spouting off. And it's on you to try to figure out, is it a real source that has a real editorial process and real standards, or is it just talk? Is it just, you know, garbage, noise?
Someone followed up. They want to know who's the most evasive or non-responsive figure you've ever interviewed?
What did they say? I thought somebody had a name. You know, I'm going to get in trouble here.
It's just us. It's just us.
Yeah, that's a line my father used to do. Between you and me. There's a certain senator, this is all I'll say, there's a certain senator from the southwestern part of the United States who ran for president who is about as evasive as anybody I know. That's all I'll say.
Okay. Well, you brought up your dad. A number of people have answered, so we're going to end on this. What's probably your biggest memory of your father and his influence on your career?
Well, it's interesting. I was talking with somebody earlier before I came out here about my dad, and who asked me kind of that question, and I said, well, he had an enormous influence on me, but not in the way people would think. He was not a stage door dad in the sense, oh, you got to go do this, you got to go do that. He never pushed me at all to be in the news business, but he was an enormous influence in terms of being in the news business just because I saw, you know, I went along with him on stories, I saw who he met, I saw where he went, and I remember thinking, gosh, what an absolutely fabulous way to make a living. Starting when I was 16 years old, in 1964, at the Republican convention in San Francisco, the Barry Goldwater convention, I was Walter Cronkite's gopher in the anchor booth. Go for coffee, go for pencils, but you know, what an extraordinary experience to see that. More importantly were the kind of life lessons he taught me, which obviously have a direct impact in terms of what I do, but I think would be enormously valuable to anybody going into any business. As the father of 6 children myself, I have long felt that it's not what we say to our kids, it's what we do that they pick up on that really is important. And what I felt from him was just this extraordinary professionalism, that you never mailed it in, no matter how tired you were, how successful you were, that every story was a news story and you gave it your all. One of the reasons I think that he was such an effective interviewer, and I'd like to think that I maybe follow in those footsteps, is the extreme value of preparation. When I'm sitting down interviewing the Secretary of State clearly knows more, I hope, about foreign policy than I do. But I know I have the advantage of knowing the subjects I'm going to ask the Secretary of State or the Senator or the President or whatever about, and I can become pretty expert on those areas. And I've always found, because as I say, people just like the guest wants to say what he wants to say in the interview and not be pushed into saying anything he or she doesn't want to say. And I think early on, if you can catch somebody, not in a gotcha sense, but if they say, well, and we're doing this there, and you can point out, just reasonably, well, yes, but, you know, there's this aspect too. If they know you're well briefed, that you know your stuff, then they're less likely to just try to snow you and to pull, you know, to sell you a bill of goods, and they have to confront the reality of the situation. So I think extreme preparation is enormously important, as I say, in the news business and every other business.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace, for coming to Tulsa and for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. Appreciate it.